Well, who else is sick of bad news? Here are some of the lowlights of the past week. Earlier on in the week, we had rash Christmas rules will cost many lives, says the British Medical Journal. And then we had UNICEF to feed hungry children in UK for the first time in 70-year history from The Guardian. And then, of course, last night's announcement, which was summarised in the Telegraph as Christmas cancelled for millions. We're all sick of bad news, aren't we? And there's not only the bad national news, but there's also the bad personal news as well. Over my past week, we've had a few bad pieces of news. Two of our friends were married this week in a Zoomed wedding with only 15 people present. Two extended family members of mine have had positive tests, which has burst our Christmas bubble. And a man I knew was hit while riding his bicycle and killed. I'm sure you've got your own stories this past week. The bad news just seems to pile up again and again. This is a year of bad news. And so it was the year that Jesus was born. Bethlehem hadn't had 12 months of sorrow, or 9 months, whatever it is for us. They'd had 600 years. They'd been ruled by a succession of tyrannical dictators. The pride of an emperor in Rome was leading a pregnant woman to have to walk 90 miles over rocky and bandit-ridden terrain. A puppet ruler killed baby boys just to firm up his rule. And add to that extreme taxation, lack of religious freedom, and roads lined with crucified freedom fighters. And you get the sense that the year of Jesus' birth made 2020 look like a trip to Santa's grotto. But in the midst of that horror, the angels say to the shepherds, "I bring you good news." It was good news to those people despite all that was going on in their world. And despite all that's going on for us this year, it's good news for us as well. Whether you're upset by the national news or you're upset by your personal news, there is some good news that can give you great joy even at a time like this. So firstly, this news is about joy. We see that in verse 10 of Luke 2. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people." We might be surprised to hear the angels say, "Do not be afraid." After all, aren't angels cute little girls in halos? Well, no. Angels in the Bible are generally not good news for the people they appear to. The first time they turn up in the Bible, they're carrying flaming swords guarding the Garden of Eden so that Adam and Eve can't return. Later on in the book of Exodus, the angel of death was sent out to slay its victims. Huge statues of angels guarded the temple to say, "Keep out." And when Isaiah, one of the prophets that we read of before, went to see a picture of God in his temple with angels surrounding him, he said, "Woe to me, for I am a man of unclean lips." I think if I was a primary school teacher again, I would cast the biggest, toughest bully in year 6 as the angel to give across the right impression. You know that feeling when you're driving along a road and then a police car appears behind you, and it doesn't matter if you're doing 28 miles an hour, you put the brakes on. You feel that guilt. Well, there's a sense in which whenever anyone saw an angel of the Lord, they felt guilty. They felt afraid. But of course, it wasn't an inappropriate guilt. You don't need to feel guilty if you're driving at 30 miles an hour and a police car comes up behind you. But if you are a human being, you do need to feel guilty when you come into the presence of God. Consider this. God has seen everything you've ever done, everything you've ever said, and everything you've ever thought. For you and me, it is appropriate for us to feel fear when we come face to face with God and his messengers. With that in mind, we should be amazed at those verses in verse 10. Do not be afraid. How can it be that this angel isn't coming with a flaming sword to smite these shepherds and all human beings? He carries on. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Many people have a fear of God and Jesus and the message of Christianity. And in some ways, that's right. But if we only see the bad news, we've missed something. It is good news. And it's good news that brings great joy. Joy in spite of us being sinful. Joy in spite of the world being painful. The kind of joy that makes people sing joy to the world when they're depressed or diagnosed with cancer or recently bereaved. Don't you want that true kind of joy? Not the fake, let's put on a Christmas jumper and pretend everything's okay kind of joy, but a real lasting joy that even when you're at your darkest moment, even when tears drip down your face, you can still say, I have true joy. Well, how did these shepherds who should be afraid have great joy? Well, next we see that this is good news about a Saviour. The Jewish people were awaiting a Saviour, a Messiah, you might have heard the phrase, a king in the line of David. They hadn't had one for 600 years, but their prophets had foretold that one day a king would return and be the Saviour of his people. It's hard for us to get our heads around how much anticipation there was among the Jewish people. This wasn't just something they hoped for. This was something they knew would come. Think about our anticipation of the vaccine. One day that vaccine will come. Life will return to normal. No more lockdowns. No more rules about who can enter your house. No more rules that ruin Christmas. Oh, just wait until that vaccine goes out to the public. Everyone's had it and life can return to the way it should be. Well, if that's how you feel about the vaccine, you have some sort of a sense of the way the Jewish people felt about their Messiah. He was going to be the great vaccine that returned things back to the way they were meant to be. Here was the message from God to those shepherds. Today in the town of David, a Saviour has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. Today. Not one day. Not in 100 years, but today. In the town of David, Bethlehem, where the prophet Micah said it was going to happen. A Saviour, someone who would save and rescue his people. And also the Lord, the most common phrase used to describe God himself at that time. The shepherds were being told that all of the prophecies were going to be fulfilled. Do you feel like you need a Saviour? Well, let's get back to that feeling of fear we should have before an angel. Do we feel fear of a God who knows everything we've ever thought, said, and done? Well, there's hope in a Saviour. You see, the reason Israel had the Romans, the reason they had all of these problems, was a punishment. They had chosen to reject God, and this was the consequences. You and I need a Saviour, not just because the world is difficult right now, but we need a Saviour because we've left God. And that's what's caused us to face the suffering we face. We're made for a perfect world. And the only reason we're not in one is because of our rejection of God. But here we hear that God has sent someone to save us, to rescue us, so we can return to the way things really should be. But how exactly does this Saviour work? Well, we see that in the last bit in verse 12. Good news about a sacrifice. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. A sign in the Bible is usually something miraculous that proves God is at work. So when Jesus was older, there were things like him healing the blind or turning water into wine or raising the dead that were called signs. They were miraculous proofs that he was who he said he was. They showed us the kind of God he was. But what's the sign here? It's something that doesn't seem all that miraculous. A baby is laying in a manger. Not the cute, cuddly kind that you might have seen on a Christmas card. An animal feeding trough. Nobody puts a baby in an animal feeding trough, but that is what God chose as the place for his Messiah to be born. God himself came down to lay in that trough. What an amazing sign. And what a sign of who God is. You know, we assume that if we were God, we would use it to make our lives easier. We'd live in a palace. We'd want to be bowed down to by all. We'd want the world to serve us. But here's the sign of who God is. God made a sacrifice. He came down to earth from heaven. Who is God and Lord of all? Heaven, a place of perfect happiness, joy, and love. He forsook to come down to this stable. As he grew up, in the early days of his life, he had to run from a murderous megalomaniac called Herod. Throughout the rest of his life, he faced rejection time and time again. And after having preached a message of how God could save, he was nailed to a cross and rejected by everyone he knew. But this is the good news. Once Jesus' disciples were arguing, two of them came up to him and they said, "When you come in your glory, Jesus, can we sit on your right hand and your left hand?" They had that same picture of glory that we all have. If I was God, I'd want to be on a great throne. But Jesus told them, the Son of Man, that was his name for himself, didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. That's what God came to do. He came to give his life as a ransom. He came to sacrifice. And that's the miraculous sign here. He came to do something that we would never expect. But why was it necessary for him to suffer? Why couldn't he have lived an easy life? Well, because of our rebellion against God, a punishment had to be paid. We deserved hell for our sin, each and every one of us. But the incredible thing is that God came himself and he took that punishment for us, dying on a cross. And if we believe in him, our price has been paid. No punishment awaits us. Why is that good news? Well, Jesus took our punishment. He took part in our suffering so that we could take part in the joy and happiness that he had in heaven. That's the good news of Christmas. It's news about a sacrifice, one who came to a manger and a cross to suffer in your place. It's news about a Saviour, God himself, come to rescue. And it's news of joy, a joy that lasts despite the circumstances of this world. How do you get hold of that for yourself? Well, like any good present, you don't have to earn it. You just receive it. There's been a lot of bad news lately. Why not take a turn at some good news this year? Good news that you can have an eternity of joy ahead of you. If that's you, and you want hold of that great joy, all you need to do is acknowledge you're a sinner in need of a Saviour and take hold of Jesus as yours. And if you do that, no matter how much more terrible this year and next year and the rest of your life may be, you'll have an eternity of joy and good news ahead of